think they're here. If they join us, they're more than welcome to come. Glad you could be here with us. We are videotaping today because there were several members who wanted to be here but couldn't be here for different reasons. But we're glad you guys were able to be here in person. Dave has came and spoke to our group once already, and I see some new faces, but a little bit of Dave's background. He's been in grief counseling for over 20 years. He was in the hospice, and I'll let him tell you more stuff, but he's done amazing things with people. I know that he was a big help with Brian and Lisa during their time, and he's helped so many people. So grief is something that everyone deals with on all different levels, and everyone deals with it differently. And there's no wrong way to deal with it, but we do have to deal with it. And so I think he can give some insight on some ways how to cope with it, because that's sort of why we changed the name of our ministry, is Living Forward Ministry, because we that are left behind still have to live. We still have to move forward, but sometimes it's hard. And so we're excited to have you here, Dave, to speak to us, and it's all yours.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'll give you my short 30-second bio that usually lasts about 2.5 minutes, but started in hospice back in 1999 and have been both bedside chaplain as well as grief counselor. In my work as a bedside chaplain, I was honored to work with over 14,000 different patients and their families. It's the strangest specialty that you will ever find. And when I'm often asked, how do you deal with it? I tell people I have met some of the most unbelievable individuals and heard some of the most unbelievable stories. And some of those you will hear throughout the presentation today. If I can get the slides to work. There we go. What exactly is this thing called grief? What I find to be interesting is that in the English lexicon, we like to take different words and mash them together and make them mean the same thing. People often will interchange grief and mourning as if they have the same meaning. They don't. Grief is what's happening inside. It is the emotional response to a loss. It is not a cycle or a stage occurrence. It is an ongoing part of your life. I am often asked by people, how long will my grief last? Depends on when your last breath comes. Grief stays with you forever. Mourning, on the other hand, is the outward expression of grief. How many of you have ever driven down a street and seen the roadside memorials that are put up? That's mourning. Oftentimes done in community, as one of the photographs shows. So that mourning is truly nothing more than the external expression of the inward feelings. It is my way of letting those feelings show. Grief, it has most often been presented throughout teaching as stages or phases or cycles. I am here to tell you that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who gave us the 5 stages of grief, actually described parenting during the summertime at dinner. Children are outside playing. You go outside and call them in. The first thing you get is denial. You call them again, you get bargaining. Just 5 more minutes, please, 5 more. You get anger when you get more insistent. I had a mother call me one night and said, my son said he hates me. You need to talk to him. I said, what did you do? Well, he was outside playing football, and it was his turn to be the quarterback, and I said, you get in here now for dinner. And he walked past me and said, I hate you. So guess what? He does. He will get over it, but he does hate you in that moment. Let him have his anger. Depression, yep. You only had kids so you could wreck my life. You don't love me. And they sulk into the bedroom, and the minute you tell them you're having hot dogs and beans and chips, you get acceptance. If only grief worked that way. What's interesting is shortly before her own death, Dr. Kubler-Ross was talking with one of her proteges, a man named David Kessler, and she said, I never intended for this the 5 stages, to become the model. Most people don't recognize grief is actually a mental health diagnosis. If I were in private practice and you came to see me and you described the emotions that you were feeling and the things that were happening to you, and it is recurrent with a death, I'm going to give you a diagnostic code that is bereavement. What happens is we get a lot of physicians that somebody goes in and the doctor says, "How you doing?" And they say, "Well, I'm feeling depressed." They will immediately put you on an antidepressant. If after 14 days the antidepressant does not show any effect to the positive, you are then relabeled as chronic depressive disorder. There's one you want on your permanent medical record. Bereavement mirrors in a lot of the same ways. But here's the interesting thing. Studies have shown that depression that comes with grief comes from the emotional seats of the brain. Clinical depression comes from the areas of the brain that are not producing enough dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine. They don't come from the same place. If you're in grief, you can take all the antidepressants you want. It's not going to affect your grief. It is not going to improve it. So we tell people when you're seeing a doctor, please be very specific that what depression you are experiencing is related to sadness, not to clinical malfunctions within the brain. We often hear people say grief is grief. It really is not. The first one that you see up there, simple grief. Simple grief is, I lost my car keys. How many of you have ever lost an item, any item? Give me some of the emotions that you felt when you lost.
Oh, angry. I can't believe it. Frustrated. And somewhat sad.
Sense of panic.
Yes.
Now, think about those emotions and graduate them up to somebody who has died. They are very similar. Not same intensity, but very similar. Compounded grief, we've had 5 deaths in the family in the last year and a half. With COVID, I have been dealing with a woman who has dealt with 14 family members who have died as a result of COVID. Now, what complicates her grief is that all 14 are directly traced back to a 43-year-old brother who nobody was going to tell him that he had to wear a mask, and if he wanted to go to the bar for a drink, he was going to the bar for a drink. So far, mom, dad, 7 siblings, number of in-laws, and a nephew have all died from COVID that he brought home because nobody was going to tell him how he was going to live. So she's not only dealing with all of the losses physically, but it's complicated by her feelings to her brother. Preparatory grief. Preparatory grief is fascinating to me, always has been. Preparatory grief is what the patient encounters when they're told they're terminal. They begin to go back across the lifespan. Who do I need to make amends with? What are the regrets? What are the things that I didn't do that I should have done? Their grief is going backwards. Anticipatory grief is the grief that the family experiences. Who's going to be here to walk me down the aisle? Dad's never going to get to rock my grandbabies. It's into the future that we begin to grieve. And so while you have a terminal situation and everybody is in grief, realize it's going in 2 different directions. Complicated versus chronic. One of the places that I most often see chronic grief is in nursing homes. I've lost my house. I've lost mobility. I got up this morning and went to breakfast. There were 4 people at the table. Came back for dinner. 2 of them have ended up at the hospital. 1 had a stroke. Every time I turn around, I'm dealing with another loss. And it is chronic. Complicated grief. Best example I can give is, years back, we dealt with a person who, Pulitzer Prize winner, very highly awarded, seen in the city and metro area as being one of the most humanitarian human beings on earth. Kids, he had 3. They could not understand why everybody was reacting to their father's death this way, because the person that was being praised as a saint had sexually abused each one of these kids as they had been adopted into the family. Talk about complicating grief. Who am I grieving? The saint or the sinner? And it really does make a tremendous difference. Sympathetic grief is also known as caregiver grief. We see it a lot in nurses, we see it in some doctors, we see it in a lot of hospice employees, where you take on the grief of the person that you're dealing with, and you become a part of a story that you don't belong in. And it is number one reason that we see compassion, fatigue, and burnout in caregivers around the country right now, is that they're constantly taking on everybody else's grief and loss. Layered grief. I lost my job. A week later, the car was repossessed. A week after that, my uncle died. It's just one on top of another. And so when you're being confronted with somebody who's in grief, try to understand, where is their grief coming from? One of the things that I was talking with Mrs. Bennett about a few minutes ago is that we've assumed all grief is the same, and it's not. When I lose a child, that's my sense of future. That's my immortality. That's the question mark. Who's going to be here to take care of me? We had a woman at Rochester who had an only son. The only son died within a matter of weeks of her husband. She was left alone. Even at the point where, standing in a funeral home, she was saying, I know my daughter-in-law is not going to take care of me. What happens when I need somebody to look out for me? And so, no, it's not the same as losing a spouse of an hour and a half. This is a person I've chosen to be with. I've shared life with. Intimacy in ways that I have not been intimate with anybody else. I've given my life to them. So if I lose a child, lose a spouse, lose a parent, it's my sense of history. Lose a sibling, that's my shared life. It isn't the same. They all hit us in different ways. And so being aware of what the loss is will help. How many of you have ever seen this chart anywhere? If you've ever been in a mental health clinic, I guarantee you've seen it, even if you don't realize. How do you feel today? I had a lady one time in a support group look at this chart and say, that looks like the first hour of my day.
I actually had one on my cubicle wall at work, and there's a little square that's magnetic, and you move the square, so it puts a circle around which face it is,
Yes,
and then people would change it every day.
it is amazing. We see this. Grief is not orderly. It's not pretty. Number one thing that people encounter emotion-wise, and I guarantee most of you have experienced this, if you've had a death in the recent past and you are anywhere and you start to laugh, everybody assumes you're okay. No. Laughter is as much a part of grieving as our tears, as our frustration, anger. I get a lot of spouses who are angry at their loved one because they died. And people say, whoa, what could you be angry about? I had a lady that said, bathroom sink plugged up. She plunged for an hour, nothing. Finally, in frustration, she slammed it down, the plunger down over the opening. She put her hand on the sink in order to get better grip. What she didn't realize is that when she did that, she covered the overflow hole and created enough suction to where the plunger worked. She said, now, you'd have thought I would have been doing a happy dance all over the house because I didn't have to call a plumber. Instead, I sat in the middle of the bathroom and cried for an hour and a half because that SOB died. That's his job, not mine. Yes. Anger becomes a part of it. Laughter. I was doing a funeral service. The short story is, this 34-year-old woman, she was diagnosed with breast cancer when she was 2 months pregnant. She was told, terminate the pregnancy, start treatment. She said, not a chance. Delivered the child. She died within 3.5 years. Day of the funeral, I had been asked to do the service. As we're getting ready for the service to begin, guess who we can't find? Little boy's gone. We tore the funeral home apart, and at one point I walked up to the podium, sat my Bible down, and as I turned, he was asleep in the casket with his mother's body. Everybody immediately, get him out of there. My response was, leave him alone and let him wake up. If you pull him out of there, I guarantee you're going to have problems you don't want for a very long time. He woke up, the service was going on, did my little opening. I was about to say the opening prayer when this same little boy, he broke wind so loud that there wasn't anybody in that building that didn't hear it, and everybody was on the floor. Yes, laughter is very much healing, and it doesn't matter where it's evoked from. Take it. Remember, emotionally, your experience with your emotions is directly related to a response because of a loss that you've suffered. Looking at the list, how many of you in the last 5 years have experienced any one of those losses? How about those? What's interesting is grief is the emotional response to a loss. I get people that'll look at the list and go, wait a minute, marriage? Yes. You've lost a great deal in the marriage. You aren't who you were when you were single. It's a loss. How do you recover from it? No, you could divorce, but that's an easy way out. Pandemic. We have been in a national grief for nearly 2 years because of the pandemic. And I find that the response that we're seeing from a lot of people right now, what fascinates me the most is, I'm done with this, I'm just getting on with my life, I don't care. It is the equivalent of somebody looking at you and saying, it's been 3 hours since the death, get over it. We've lost a lot since March of 2019 as a result of a disease. If you want to see a fascinating special, CNN did a special, it was hosted by Anderson Cooper, and it looked at the pandemic of 1918, myths that he destroyed. It was called the Spanish flu, but the first cases of the flu didn't show up in Spain until 1920. It was brought back to the United States by soldiers returning from World War I. And if you look it up historically, we lost more soldiers to the H1N1 influenza than we lost in battle. What's interesting is the response that was given then and the response we're seeing now. We are still being inoculated against the H1N1 flu because nobody's going to tell me I have to get a vaccine. My guess is 105 years from now, people will still be vaccinated for coronavirus 19. But you look at that list, for most seniors, one of the bigger losses that they experience is moving out of their house and into an extended care facility or an assisted living. Everybody thinks it's a good thing for mom or dad, and it may be, but it's also a tremendous loss. Needs to be recognized. Children in grief. There are so many myths about kids and loss that we need to really kind of step back. First of all, studies indicate that children as young as 1 hour out of the womb can experience grief. Medically, it is called failure to thrive. Where this is seen very heavily is in infants that are withdrawn from the mother before the child has had a chance to bond. Whether it's adoption, whether it is medical need, whatever, separating that child will set them up for loss. We know from studies, hearing is intact at about 4 months in gestation. So imagine 5 months of listening to your mother's voice and the voices of people around you, and all of a sudden those voices are gone. It's a huge loss. Studies also indicate that children's teardrops during high stress and anxiety do not contain adrenaline or cortisol. Conversely, if you are in a high stress or high anxiety situation, grief, and they test your teardrops, cortisol and adrenaline are number 1 and 2 by volume in every teardrop. God has built it into the human being that if I cannot run out or deal with my cortisol adrenaline flow, fight or flight, I can flush my system through tears. The old wives' tale about you just need to have a healthy cry, it is very much legitimate. Studies out of Mayo Clinic produced 2 years ago, they did autopsies on 75 people that had died within 6 months of their spouse, and 75 who had not experienced a death in the recent past. What they found is that those people who had had a recent loss, suffered a heart attack, had 3.5 to 5 times the amount of adrenaline and cortisol in their heart than the normal person should. They died of a broken heart. It is legitimate. Kids, they will do fits and starts because they can't cry that adrenaline out. So when you see a child bouncing off the walls at a funeral home, they're grieving. Grief is directly related to an emotional and developmental age. If you look at 3-year-olds, there isn't anything in their world that's permanent. People come and go all the time. Grandpa died. Yep, he'll be back next week. Yeah. Why? Because people come and go all the time. 12-year-old, grandpa's died. That is an earth-shattering event for a 12-year-old because I now have permanence in my life and I can associate. So if grandpa can die, so can dad. All of a sudden, I'm going to get very hypervigilant about where's dad. I got to know all the time. Why? Because grandpa's not here and he's not coming back. When talking with kids, keep it simple. Fill in the last S. When you are explaining death and use the language. Modern day America, I love the phrase. You mentioned it a while ago. I lost my husband a week ago. Then why are you here? Shouldn't you be out looking for him? We don't lose people, they die. My favorite medical term, expired. 14,000 plus patients over a 15-year period of time. Never found an expiration date stamped on any of them. Nobody will tell me where it is. Apparently doctors know. No, keep it simple. They want more information. Any of you have ever had an experience with a child? They'll ask for it. Avoid inadvertently blaming God for a death or anybody else. God took grandma home to heaven and she'll never come back. In the mind of a 5-year-old, you just described a kidnapper. And then we wonder why kids grow up and don't want any part of God. There is a direct correlation. Include children in the end-of-life care, visitation, funeral services as much as they want to be involved. Best example I can give you is a young man who I took care of his father at the end of life. His wife of this patient was an oncology and hospice nurse. He was 6 at the time. She taught him how to give injections through what's called a sub-Q button. He would bathe his dad with her. He is in his 2nd year of medical school. He wants to be a hospice physician. A year after his dad died, his uncle was diagnosed. He came to his mom one day and said, "Could you call my cousins and tell them they need to take me out to dinner?" She thought, that's a bizarre request. When she said, "Why?" He said, "Because I need to sit down and tell them what they have to do to take care of their dad." Yes, let them be involved. The other side of that is, did a funeral service 21 years after a death because a 2-year-old son was not allowed to go to the funeral because nobody thought he could handle it. And for 21 years, he missed a dad that nobody would let him grieve. Include them. Always have a safety plan. If they get too wild and you can't handle them at the funeral home, make sure somebody is there that can take them out to a park. Take them home, take them to McDonald's, whatever. Let them be involved at the level they want to be involved at. As much as you want to protect a child from death, you can't. Longitudinal studies have shown that how you allow a child to grieve will set them up for how they deal with every single loss for the rest of their life. Not just death, loss. One of the things I challenge crowds with is go back to the very first person of significance in your life who died and examine how you were allowed to grieve, and then look at your history of how you've dealt with losses beyond that. One of the most astounding that I will use as an example, it's unbelievably personal. My father's mom died when he was 5. His brother was 9. It was in rural Tennessee, little church funeral service. They took the bodies of she and a baby that she lost, baby sister. The morning of the funeral, my grandfather walked into the bedroom and looked at this 5-year-old and 9-year-old and said, "If either one of you shed so much as a tear, I will beat you both." And he knew they would. First time I saw my father cry at all, Thanksgiving, 2 years before he died. He was suffering Parkinson's. He had been nonverbal for a year. All of us kids were singing with him. And out of nowhere, in a voice that none of us had heard for a long time, he said, "All I ever wanted was for somebody to tell me I was a good boy. I didn't cry at a funeral." It'll set you up for how they deal with loss. Let them grieve the way that they need to. What not to say to children. Doesn't it look like grandma sleeping? Anybody here ever been to a funeral where the body is being viewed? Do they look like they're sleeping? I mean, am I missing something? Nobody I have ever loved who has died and has been viewed looked like they were sleeping. The doctors couldn't fix fill in the blank. Say that to a 4-year-old and then let them know, by the way, we're going to the doctor next week. Why? Kids will take in what you tell them. I have long been a practitioner. I call this the Chips Ahoy or Cheerios or Oreos theory. It was born out of a situation where we had a grandmother who was dying. Family had asked if we would come in and talk with the kids. Kids were all about 10 grandkids between 4 and 12. If you ever want to have fun, tell kids, whatever you want to ask me about death, go ahead. Questions we got. It always seems that Jesus is on a cloud and coming to earth. So on a really clear day where there's no clouds, is that his day off? No tears in heaven. So if I fall and skin my knee, I'm going to be no tears? Kids are fascinating. One of them said, I don't understand this dying. Social worker that I was with went into this incredible explanation that if you had been a PhD student, you'd have eaten it up. But if you were a 5, 6, 7-year-old, they were looking at her like she was from Mars. Out of nowhere, I said, what's your favorite cookie? Everybody thought, Dave's just being Dave. He's trying to distract them. Ask kids what their cookie is and tell them to describe it. You will learn more about cookies than you ever wanted to. But when they finished, I said, you know what, gang? Your grandma's body is like that bag of cookies. Everything you want is inside. That's where all the hugs start. That's where all the presents come from. That's where all the love is. But grandma's body is getting more and more empty. And pretty soon it's going to be empty. And when a cookie bag is empty, what do? Want them immediately? You throw it away. Yes. But see, we don't throw bodies away. We do a funeral service where we put the body away. And I went, oh. Shopping one day about a year ago, a young man walked up to me and said, you don't know me, but he was one of the kids who had been sitting in that room that day. He said, I have used that, I can't tell you how many times with how many friends. It makes sense. Yes. Separate the person from the body. Let the person be who the person is. Bodies get old, they get sick, they die. Only answer the questions that kids ask, not the one that you think they're asking. Friend said her kid walked in one day, was about 5, and said, hey, Mom, where'd I come from? She panicked. Sat him down, explained the birds and bees from A to Z, looked at him after 45 minutes and said, any other questions? He said, yeah, where did I come from? She said, I just told you. What do you mean? He said, well, Bobby said he came from Baltimore. Where did I come from? Anybody here have that experience with a child where they ask a question, you give them an answer, and they look at you and go, yeah. Answer the question they ask. So what do I do with all of this once I've identified it? This is what I refer to as transitioning to hope. The following is inspired in me by a gentleman named William Bridges, he wrote 2 books. And the first one was called Transitions, which is widely used in businesses. The second one is Transitions, a personal story. He went back and rewrote it after the death of his wife. Within transitions, you find yourself coming back in new ways to old activities. I've always said first holidays are especially reminiscent of this. We're going to do everything the same as we have always done it. Pop quiz, how is that possible? You can replicate absolutely every activity, but there's always going to be one thing missing. The person who's died. So no matter how hard you try to do all those old activities, they're never going to be the same. They're not supposed to be. Every transition begins with an ending. Notice the photograph. There are 3 houses at the end of this road. The only way that you're going to get to any one of those 3 houses is to travel the road. Grief is not something that you can avoid. It is a part of you that you need to experience, you need to deal with, you need to move forward with. When somebody says you need to move on, what they're implying is stop talking about your past. It's not possible. That person is a part of who we are. Some part of you will resist the ending as though your life depended on it. I have been bedside with thousands of people as they were dying. I have also been attendant, very personally, with 5 of my own family members at the end of their life. Everybody in my family assumes I'm strong. When my aunt was going through the end of her life, she'd suffered a massive heart attack, loss of oxygen, was shutting down all of her organs. Guess who was chosen to go sit down and talk to her about what was happening? I'm tired of hearing my family say, Dave will do it. To sit with my aunt and to describe to her, if they take the ventilator off, this is what's going to happen. But then to remind her, you can choose to stay on the ventilator, but you will never be able to hold your grandkids. You will never be able to go shopping, her favorite pastime. The things you want to do, you will end up laying in a bed on machines for who knows how long. And for her to look at me and write, stop it all. I didn't want to have that conversation. I wanted the aunt who was willing to spoil me to stick around. I wanted her to see her kids grow up, grandkids. I resisted the fact that the end was going to come as if my life depended on it. We do that in transitions. And I have to remind myself, something has to end before something can begin. You can't start a new life unless the old one stops. Endings, disengagement, better known as shock. The greatest gift that God put into us for those moments is shock. My brain shuts down to where I will only absorb what I can. If I had to absorb full impact at that moment, you could watch my brain float out of my ear. I will disengage. Are you listening to us? Matter of fact, no, I'm not. You're not telling me anything I want to hear. Whenever I talk with doctors and present to doctors, the best way to aid families in disengagement, especially in a trauma situation, doctors would walk in and they would say, my name is Dr. So-and-so, and I'm here to talk to you about your loved one. We did everything we could. Well, anybody who's ever watched a medical show knows that the next line is, and they'll be ready to go to lunch with you in 20 minutes. It's my sad duty to inform you that they have expired. And these families would sit there going, huh? Meaning what? Doctors would say, what do I do? You walk in and hit them right between the eyes with a shovel. Hi, my name is Dr. Smith, and it's my sad duty to inform you that your loved one has died. Kickstart the shock. Why? Because to delay it can be dangerous. Kickstart it. Disidentification, you begin to immediately go through, wait a minute, who am I? An hour ago, I was a wife, I was a husband, I was a sister, brother, whoever. Now who am I? Disenchantment. Would you like a sandwich? Sure. Turkey okay? Yeah. Sandwich comes out. I don't like this cheese. I don't like turkey. Who thought I wanted this bread? Nothing satisfies. Everything around me is disappointing. Why? Because at the bottom of it, the one thing that I want, the person, is not there. Disorientation. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? Why am I doing it? These things all can go from hours to days to months. If somebody is trying to shove you through any one of these stages or these items within endings, don't let them. I used to get nurses, Mrs. So-and-so is in denial. Is it her best coping mechanism? Well, seems to be, then leave it alone. It'll disappear as it needs to. We're too quick to push people through the process of reestablishing a new life. I get to the neutral zone. I find myself surrendering. Yes, this is really happening. and I can't change it. I wave the white flag. But with that becomes a sense of renewal. I start to be aware of there are things I need to do. There are things I need to change. I need to find those places that I have to change and get to them. Perspective. Number one, in perspective, and because we see a lot of anticipatory grief in families prior to a death, this is one where families would say, yes, Dad has extreme Alzheimer's. He doesn't know who any of us are. He's bedbound, but we want the doctors to do everything to keep him alive. Why? Is it going to change anything that's happening? No. Then why are you pursuing it? I will tell people, I'm a firm believer that just because medicine can do something doesn't necessarily mean it should. 95-year-old patient who's going to go through a triple bypass surgery. Great, you can get them under the anesthesia. Can you get them back out? And once you get them out from under the anesthesia, how much damage is going to have been done to the brain? And at 95, why are we doing this to them? 50-year-old, different story. Perspectives change. After the death, what was a doctor's failing all of a sudden becomes, no, this was so serious and so severe that nothing was going to change the outcome. I get families that would say, we want you to pray for a miracle. Great, but are you willing to accept the miracle God chooses to produce? Not always the same. Wisdom. Death teaches us a lot about ourselves. It's an old adage amongst preachers that says, astounding how many people want to go to heaven, but how few are willing to die to get there. I'm one who's very heavy into Hebrew. Wisdom, we have always utilized the word faith in modern day Christianity to express belief. The ancient Hebrew, the word faith means trust. I don't believe God is there, I know He is. So my faith is all about, do I trust Him to produce what He says He will? If you go back and look at all of the miracles Jesus performed, is there ever a case where He performed a miracle that crafted something entirely new to replace whatever was damaged in the person He was healing? Or did He take natural body process and reverse it? Best example, when Peter cut off the ear of Malchus in the garden, Jesus did not make a new ear. He took the ear off the ground and reattached it miraculously. He didn't give a new heart to David when David cried out, rip this heart out of me and put a new one in. No, He worked on the heart David had to change that. I began to gain a whole new wisdom and understanding of what it is that I'm doing and dealing with. And finally, in the neutral zone, I accept the ending. I begin to realize this is now my life. And I need to determine what direction it will move. Nobody gets to make that decision for you. It's all yours. Sure, now the battery wants to die. There we go. With new beginnings, I always tell people transition to hope is really best understood in the empty nest syndrome. How many of you have experienced the empty nest syndrome or know of it? Everybody? When a person first moves out of the house, their room becomes a shrine. We're not moving anything, we're not changing anything, all the dust bunnies are staying right where they are. That is Johnny's room, and that's just the way it is. But eventually, you start walking down the hall and you stop and you think, you know, I really want a man cave. And then you go, no, I can't do that. That's Johnny's room. But pretty soon, you're not just thinking it would be a nice room. You begin to investigate what goes into it. Change the carpeting, get a big screen TV, right lazy boy, mini fridge. I'm going to get all of these things, and then you begin to go out and buy them. You paint the room, and anybody who comes over, you got to see the room. You put the furniture in, you got to see. Carpet goes down. All of these additions start to get celebrated. And you find that you're enjoying the energy of revitalizing this room. You're sitting at the kitchen table one day and you look up and you say, you know, can't believe what I did with Johnny's room. Why? It's always going to be Johnny's room. Doesn't matter how it looks. It's always going to be Johnny's room. In the same way, when somebody dies, people expect you in time, stop talking about them. Don't. How many of you have ever seen the movie Coco? Ooh, I'll give you a homework assignment. It's a Disney Pixar movie, and it is one of the most incredible movies that I have ever seen about what it means to perpetuate heritage. It's predicated on Dia de los Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead in Mexico. Sounds gory and gross, but every year the Detroit Institute of Arts does a massive display. It is incredible. The goal of this ceremony, this day, is that you will put the photographs or pictures of your descendants up on an ofrenda, and you celebrate them. The belief is that when the last person on earth forgets who you are, you cease to exist in eternity. And the whole movie is about this little boy who thinks that he's chasing his heritage, only to find out he's chasing the wrong heritage. And when he comes back to the heritage, he saves the eternity of one of his relatives. There was a Christian hymn written a few years ago. If the Bible was still being written today, what would people read about your life 1,000 years from now? One of my favorite quotes, imagine 1,000 generations from now, as you're standing in heaven, somebody walks up to you and says, "You're Dave." And you look at them and you go, "Yeah, I'm here today because you handed your Christianity off to your children, and it flowed straight through to me." Death is not an ending. It is a beginning. How do I know this? I share this gentleman with a lot of the audiences I speak in front of. His name was Yaroslav. When I met him, he was 103, sharp as a tack. The only thing wrong, his body wore out. At 26, Yaroslav had graduated from the University of Warsaw in Poland, degree in architecture. He went home to the village, and in the village he was from, his dad was a doctor. A year after graduation, he was conscripted into the Polish infantry and commissioned a lieutenant. The year was 1933. Not long after his conscription in, Adolf Hitler's forces decided to invade Poland. Yaroslav's troops were the first ones to meet them. He was shot and wounded, captured, sent to Camp 122, where he remained for 7 years. Camp 122 was not too far from Baden-Baden, and so he sat for 7 years and watched the smokestacks and realized There wasn't anything that he could do to affect what was happening beyond the gates that surrounded him. The Russians were the ones who liberated the camp. Imagine 7 years a prisoner. He weighed barely 100 pounds, hadn't had shoes for over a year and a half, pants pretty much tattered, but the gates were opened and the prisoners were told, leave. He walked over 600 kilometers from the camp to the village. It was 2.5 years after he got home before anybody could tell him that his mother and father had been executed the day that the Germans occupied their village because they were educated. Now, if anybody had a reason to say, done, I don't want to be a part of life anymore, it would have been Yaroslav. Nope. He came to the United States, found a bride, became an architect here in the States. One of the legacies he leaves is he was part of the architectural team that designed the H. Wright Museum in Detroit. Why? When the builders decided they wanted an architect who understood oppression, yeah, I would think a guy who spent 7 years in a concentration camp. Shortly before Yaroslav died, he was sitting on his back porch. He lived in a condo. The back porch, literally, if you want to call it a porch, was about 15 feet wide and about 20 feet deep. And he was sitting there that day looking at a tree just outside the fence. He called me David. David came in that day and staring at the tree. I said, Yaroslav, where are you? He said, do you know I could tell the seasons for 7 years by watching the leaves on a tree just like that outside the gates at 1:22. He got quiet for a few minutes. Then he looked over and he said, I have a question. I said, yes, what's your question? He always had a question. It was always theological. But today he said, I must give you the story before I give you the question. I said, okay. He said, this morning as I was sleeping, I could hear my wife, his first wife who had died 40 years prior. I could hear her calling to me. And so I began traveling a path. The flowers were more fragrant, the colors more vibrant, everything more alive than anything I have ever seen on this earth. As I came around a bend, I could hear my mother begin singing to me lullabies from my childhood. And I was approaching a gate, stone wall with a simple gate. And as I reached out to touch the gate, my wife, his second wife, woke me up. I said, what is your question? He said, was it a dream? We were quiet for a moment. I finally looked at him and I said, Yaroslav, what do you believe? He again was quiet, kept his attention on the tree. And he said, David, I believe had she let me sleep another 30 seconds, we would not be having this conversation. A week later, incidents took place where his wife, he had fallen asleep. She put the guardrails up on his bed, and when he woke up, he was not a 103-year-old man laying in a hospital bed in his living room. He was a 29-year-old captive in a concentration camp. And he got out of the bed, out of their condo. She called the police. 3 cars responded. When the first officer approached him, 103-year-old man in an adult brief picked this officer up by the bulletproof vest and threw him across the hood of a car. I got a call from the nurse saying, how fast can you get here? When I got there, he was screaming in Polish. I don't know any Polish at all. We got him settled down, finally got him back to sleep. The officer came up and said, could you explain what happened, please? And I said, yeah. You approached a young man in a concentration camp, and every ounce of adrenaline in his body said attack. So thank you. That makes sense. Yaroslav died a week later. I was privileged to speak at his funeral. I want his story to continue. Why? Because he lived, he was significant. Not because he was a survivor of a concentration camp or an architect of a famous building, but because he was Yaroslav. And he had the courage to keep inhaling and exhaling until it was time to go home. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in one of his writings, said, "It is not in his goals, but in his transitions that man or woman is great." Notice the photographs. If you have been brave enough to commit the way that the couple up on the top of the screen has, then eventually you will experience what is taking place in that bottom photograph. Most ministers, when we say, "Till death do you part," the couple in front of us immediately thinks it's a joke. But then you wake up 20 minutes later and realize at age 80 or 85, it's not a joke. And that same aisle that you walked down with all the hope and promise of a future now holds the casket of the loved one whose future you shared. In closing, the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica, "Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you will not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope." I know this was Holy Spirit empowered, because if you study Paul's life, Paul would have put a period after "we don't want you to grieve." But that's not what he says. The difference in grieving with hope and grieving without hope is the difference in night and day. Anybody want to talk about my mother, my father, other people in my life who have died? You are going to get tears very quickly. But it is because they are home free, and I have to walk life without them. Any questions, comments? Yes.
William Bridges, he wrote two different books or something?
He wrote two different books, basically the same title. One is called Transitions, which is used in a lot of businesses about buyouts, mergers, and how do you merge and transition those. The other was a book called Transitions, the other story, and it was written after his wife died.
What's the name of the author?
William Bridges.
Do you have like your whole presentation like in a pamphlet or something that you can reflect back on? Or?
Absolutely. They've got it on flash drive. Feel free to print it off.
Yeah, he sent us this, so we can make copies.
It was hard, you know, I want to break everything down, but you have so many good things that I would like to read. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I have a great secretary.
Yes, ma'am.
They always said that, like, when the person is in, like, a comatose state, that they can still hear you. Is that still true if they had hearing loss?
Yes. One of the most amazing things that we had happen was, and it was not something that Beaumont Hospice, who I worked for, was involved with, was actually a personal. I don't know if any of you know Frank Lytle, Frank and Lois Lytle, longtime members down at the old Strathmore and then over at Oakland. They have 3 sons, 2 are still in the area. Frank lost his hearing when he was 2. One of the most amazing people I've ever met. He retired as the chief engineer of the River Rouge Ford plant. And at his retirement dinner, Henry Ford actually gave him his retirement gift. And Frank's only comment was, "Well, Mr. Ford, you don't have to worry about me suing the company for hearing loss because I came to work with it." at the end of toward the end of his life, people would say things outside of the room, and when they would come in, Frank would say, "I disagree," or he would make comment on what they had said. And this is a man who, his hearing was absolutely zero. Comatose people, there are a lot of studies where they have taught people how to speak other languages while they were in a coma. I'm sorry?
You suggested for us to watch.
Coco. Coco. C-O-C-O.
I'll watch it, I don't know how many times.
I have a 18-month-old grandson that his 3 big movies, Coco, Encanto, and Trolls. And we find it interesting that the 2, Encanto and Coco, are very heavy into family and heritage and how do you carry those things out. We have a history and it's important. I am one of those that I have been a long time believer when somebody says to me, America's a great melting pot. My challenge is take an 8-pack of crayons, 8 separate colors, put them in a pot and melt them. What do you get? One homogeneous, gloppy, ugly color. No. Celebrate the differences. Celebrate them. That's why God gave them to us. Know who we are, where you came from. Yes.
My mom recently passed in November, and my neighbor's grandchild was 10. And I said, I'm really close to I have three granddaughters. But the granddaughters are over, like 10 and 8 and 6. I sat down with them and we talked, and I told them that I would have moments breaking down and crying. And so, like lately, they'll do something and I just lose it. So do I tell them and remind them again? So I don't want them to think that they're making me cry, but, so how do I handle that?
Different people handle it different ways. Around our family, the grandkids all know it as, I'm having a grandpa moment. They go, what? Oh, yeah. They know. My dad died, it'll be 3 years coming up here pretty quick. And it's, my 7-year-old, almost 7-year-old, she remembers Grandpa, but she doesn't remember him other than being sick. But she knows if I say, I'm just having a Grandpa moment. Just something I thought about my dad. Like, oh, okay. She goes on about her business.
And your dad was the one that was told as a young boy that he was
Most men in here, and I almost guarantee it, how many of you heard the phrase, big boys don't cry? Oh, yeah, they do. We have 3 incidences in the New Testament where Jesus himself cried.
Yes.
If God in flesh can cry, why can't I? Genesis 5th chapter. It grieved God that he made man. I'm going to bet there were more than a few tears in heaven over that one. A friend of mine who's a theologian has written I don't know how many books, has said, anybody ever wonders why it got dark while Jesus was on that cross? It's because his understanding is that God left creation. That his grief was so profound that if he had stayed, we would have no hope. He had taken his son off that cross. Whether he's right or wrong, I think he's probably more right than not.
very interesting, that's for sure, a different thought.
Helping little boys understand there are going to be times in your life where something hurts, whether it's physically or emotionally. And people will look at you, they rub a little dirt on. Big boys don't cry. big boys do cry, and it's okay.
There must be not some people think they're, well, I mean, that was too extreme for your father, obviously, but some people think that they're helping a little by time, you know, like our uncle. I still can't remember, like it was just yesterday, but he didn't, like, his sister mentioned about him, but yes, we kind of left our family, unfortunately. But we lost our brothers too. And so my mom lost two sons, you know, in her lifetime before she passed. And, but her, you know, her brother thought our uncle was doing good by saying, you know, you cry now. You know, your mother's very upset. She doesn't need to see you cry. And that, oh my God, that just stuck with me and stuck with me. So when we lost, I was waiting for my daughter. We were at my house waiting for my daughter to get there and to tell her. And I mean, that's always stuck with me. It always has. And I told my sister, at times I just, you know, like, I feel like I can't stop. It's gonna come. I can't stop it sometimes. But telling my daughter, like, she was like, well, Mom, they all kept on like, Mom, I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm worried about you, Mom, because you know. And I can see why. But I think it comes from when we had that first major loss of our first brother that died. It really bothers me like that. And that's how you're speaking. I think there's truth to it. It wasn't just me overanalyzing. Put it that way.
Yeah. We do and say good things. Where I just sit and I want to scream at times. Don't cry, it'll upset mom or dad. You don't think they're already upset enough? How are my tears going to upset them any more than they already are? And am I not inviting them to share their grief with me as much as I want to share my grief with them? I mean, that's like a husband or wife who have gone through, and I'll pick on the Canes for a minute, but that would be like Lisa and Brian having gone through that first loss with them, and having people look at them and say, Brian, you can't cry. You got to be strong for Lisa. Really? No. It's okay to share the tears and the laughter and everything in between. They're in a better place. And this helps me how? I'm going to pick the phone up and call and say, hey, Mom, I got a question. Unfortunately, I didn't get the toll-free number to heaven. Your mother wouldn't want you to be upset that she's gone. Got a newsflash for you, folks. She'd also be the first person to put her arms around me and say, we're going to get through this together. That's part of why I'm crying and grieving, is because she's not here to do that. We want to dismiss grief because your grief makes me uncomfortable. I'll give you all a newsflash. One of the best descriptors in the world. Part of the reason that people will avoid you in grief is that you're a carrier. You are an absolute carrier. You've experienced a death, and I know in my own life, I will never have to experience that unless you infect me. And so, as long as you don't infect me, I'll be okay. So I'll be dismissive. I'll be at the funeral home and I'll look at you and say, we're going to go now and we'll pray for you. Call me anytime. I'll challenge you. If you've ever had somebody say, call me at any time, set your alarm for 3 in the morning and call. See what you get. They don't mean it.
You just said really struck home for me when you said that my husband's house, he's lost his mother many years ago, but he said, he didn't say like, oh, life goes on or anything like that. He just said, what you said, that your mom wouldn't want you to feel like this. You know, what do I say to him? And something like that. Of course my mom would want me to be sad, but I didn't say that. I don't know.
I'll give you one of the greatest lines I ever witnessed. The wife is the one who's laying in a bed dying. She was about 55. And her husband kept walking around, I'm going to be the stoic man if it kills me. And one day he's sitting there, and she looks at him, and she's getting more and more frustrated. She finally says, "Will you man up?" He looked over at her and he said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, start acting more like a woman." He sat and cried for 2.5 hours. Sometimes the myths that we create are absolutely stupid and ridiculous.
I was always told that if a man can cry, you're more of a man. And that's how I explain it to my sons and my grandsons. It's okay.
I am a big one in telling my oldest grandson and my younger grandson, grandparent, know what you're crying about. I can remember getting hurt as a kid, my dad looking at me and saying, "If you don't knock off the crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about." And I looked at him and said, "Don't need anything more." Wrong thing to say, but as I look back, coming from a man who was told at 5 years of age, if you can't cry at your mother's funeral, then what is there that you can cry about?
That's tough. That's tough to hear that.
And courage. Emotions are given to us for a reason. A husband who doesn't want to shed tears, can we sit down and pre-plan your funeral so that when you kill yourself from adrenaline overdose, I'll know what to do? Kids, I love watching kids because there is no pretense. If they're having a bad day, they're having a bad day. I know a lot of people that don't like working with patients who have dementia. I love working with dementia patients. First of all, you never know what's coming out of their mouth. Second, it's almost always honest. Third, if you want absolute confirmation that there is a huge difference between the human brain and the human spirit. When my dad sat in a cafeteria in a nursing home and said all I ever wanted was for people to tell me I was a good boy. That didn't come out of his brain. It came straight out of his spirit. The Spirit of God grieved that He made us. Think in terms of what do you possess personally, emotionally, mentally, physically that is not in the very image of God?
Yeah, what?
That is not in the very image of God. If I can cry, I can because somewhere God has that same capacity. Could not have put tears into me if He didn't know what they were. Oftentimes, and I've even said this to more than one man, do not deny promises and the hopes of God by shoving your emotions down. No. Be the God creature you are created to be. What's interesting, kind of as a wrap-up, in the teardrop studies, when adults cry high stress, high anxiety, as I said, cortisol and adrenaline are the top two. There are 17 chemicals in every teardrop when we cry in high stress or anxiety. When we cry at a Hallmark commercial, it's salt water. In all of the studies that have been done and completed, human beings are the only animal on the planet capable of tears in which adrenaline, cortisol, or any other chemicals from the brain show up in teardrops. Yes, we are created in the image of God. celebrate that, even in grief. We're over my time, your time. Thank you all very much.
Well, again, we're glad that everyone showed up for this. I think understanding grief is a step to help you get through grief. Understanding that it's okay to grieve, it's okay to cry, it's okay to be angry, it's okay to deal with all these different emotions that you deal with when you're losing somebody, and all the transitions that you have to go through. And everyone's transition is different. Just one quick story is that never in a million years when I worked for state police, for those who didn't know, that was a state trooper. I was commander of the motorcycle unit. And we were excited when we got the chance to take our vehicles home, because we would start from work from home and end at home. And you know, now you don't have to go to the post, you can just go to work. And it was a great way to do the job. We were excited about that. I was. Never in a million years did I think about when you're going to lose somebody. I had a trooper get killed at 75 in Dixie. And that meant that I had to go to his house and get all his uniforms. It took his wife 6 months before she would allow me to come and get them, and they were exactly how he left them. But she couldn't deal with the fact of not seeing those uniforms in the closet. I mean, it was hard on me to go get them, but I can only imagine what she had to do, what she had to go through, knowing that those uniforms were going to be gone. But she has transitioned into that. She learned it took time, and it's just something you have to do. So everyone goes through these different transitions. And I think talking about them, sharing them, and just getting support is what gets you through there. Biggest thing is with God's help. God set up this family, a church family, for a reason, because he knew that we'd need each other to support each other. And that's great that we're able to do that. So let's close with a prayer, and then we'll dismiss. Heavenly Father, we praise you and we glorify you that we were made in your image, that you made us just like you. And knowing that, we know that it's okay to grieve. And knowing that it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be angry, and it's okay to laugh when you have those good memories. And I pray comfort on everyone that is going through loss. I pray that you surround them with your love and put people in their lives to help them transition into hope. And just bless them, Lord. And just help us to always remember that we have each other, and more importantly, we have you as we go through these transitions. Thank you for David, and bless him in his ministry, and just allow him to help people, Lord. And thank you for this day. And it's through Christ's name we pray. Amen.